Today I'm going to be painting this snow scene and giving some tips and the process I go through while breaking this down and making it as simple as I can. So off we go. I'm creating a canvas. I'm using Procreate, an iPad, 4000 by 4000 pixels. You want the resolution to be pretty big so you can get some nice details in there without it going too blurry. So my first job is to get the big shapes in, and I use the Select freehand color fill in Procreate. You don't have to use this, you could use a regular brush, but basically the concept is about getting the major shapes down on separate layers. So I'll have the sky in one, I have the big trees in another, and then I'll put the ground layer basically on one or two. That's optional. I'll put the little stream on another one. The reason I'm doing layers is mainly so I can change the colors. So if you get the colors wrong, you can just change them like I'm doing now, hue, saturation, and brightness. I'll use those, or that tool in Procreate, quite a lot if I get the colors wrong. And I'm not too bothered about the colors right now. I can change them eventually. But all I'm trying to do is mainly get the shapes in and get the composition how I want. So I'm putting in some rocks. These rocks are going to have snow all over them. So usually rocks would be some sort of gray, right? But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to make them bluish because that's going to be the shadow color of the snow. Now, it's just a good rule of thumb to say shadow side of the snow is going to be blue. It's not always blue, but for this composition, it's going to be blue. So when you have snow on top of things, try to paint under the snow first and then on top of the snow. So we put a layer of blue underneath, and then I'll put the actual highlights of the snow on top, making sure to leave plenty of the blue underneath. Now, eventually I'll tweak this blue because it went a little bit gray, so I'll try to beef that up in a second. Okay, so I'm messing around with the riverbed, and basically what we're looking for is kind of a browny gray. It's going to be fairly dark at this point, and then I will highlight as I go. But the one thing you want to do with water in general is start out really dark and then go brighter as we go. You can see sometimes I have trouble with this color fill, depending on if you hit that little dot thing correctly. It can accidentally not fill things in, and you'll see me like color dropping things now and again. It's basically me doing color fill and missing the dot, so don't worry about that. And the brush I'm using is the technical pen in the inking section. It doesn't really matter which brush you use, but it does matter if you're going to try and do my kind of style, is that the brush is hard edge. So if it's a soft edge brush, the whole painting is going to kind of look out of focus, and you don't want that. We want some soft edges, but not many. And you can see I'm merging in some of this water hue, and I'm using the smudge tool. When I use the smudge tool, I have a soft airbrush. So the point of the smudging is to blend, basically, even though it's called smudge. Could also be called the blend tool. And I don't use the blend tool that often, but especially with things like water and clouds, mist, things like that. So you want to keep your soft parts of your painting quite rare. So because if you have too much soft, it'll look blurry. And if it's all hard, it will look kind of weird in a different way. So a nice mix is both in there at some point, and I find having less blurry is or blended is better than the other way around. So one thing I like to do when I'm working on trees is I blob them out, as you can see, without too much care, and then I use the eraser to shape them up a bit. So at this point, I'm just feeling out bits of the painting and I'll go from the trees to the water to the bank. And what I'm trying to do is just get a bit of everything. I don't like working on a section for too long. You can. There's nothing wrong with that, but I like to, build up the painting all in one. So I don't like to spend too much time in one area and neglect another one, because of consistency. Basically, I want to. So I was like, okay, I'm working on this tree now. Tree's looking okay. Kind of makes sense. Now I need to go and do that to the other tree. So I'm doing the same again, same concept for the tree as I did on the floor with the rocks, is that I'm using the under color, you can say, of the snow, which is blue, and then putting the highlight whitish on top of the blue. So that just gives you the shadow color of the snow kind of for free. And there's always going to be shadow when you're doing snow, always, because there's always a part that the highlights don't get to. So this is what I meant about jumping around. So I did that tree. So let's go to this section and do that tree and tree bunch, whatever you want to call them. And I'm using the color fill tool again. I bounce between the color tool and the technical pen. Basically, if I got big shapes, I'll use the color fill. And if I have small shapes, I'll use the technical pen. Because if it's too small, the color fill is hard to do. So, and plus to add more detail, you want a little pen. So if you're using a pen or brush or whatever, it doesn't really matter what it is as long as it's got hard edges and it's not too big or too small. So find a nice size that fits for your resolution. So depending on which resolution you picked. So this is 4000 by 4000. So the size of the brush, is just relative to that. But really what you want is to be able to do like areas like I'm doing right now without taking ages and without it being too small. If it's too small, it'll kind of look scratchy. So you want the brush size kind of relative to what you're doing. I know that sounds kind of weird, but try it out and you'll see if it's too small. So you'll know it's too small if it looks like you got really like fine lines. That's too small. You can't go really too big, but if you go too big, obviously you can't do any detail. So just find the right brush that seems that you don't need to mess around with the size too much. So I generally stick it at one size and then leave it. The thing about the technical pen though is if you don't put too much pressure on it, the brush goes smaller, and if you press it harder, the brush goes bigger because it's tapered. So that's why it's quite nice with that one. So I don't really want to get into brush mechanics too much, but the tapered ones are easier to control the size as you're using the pressure. So if you use the soft brushes, if you press hard, it generally means you're going to have more of the color come out. But if you have the tapered ones, the pressure means it's going to go from skinny to big. So that's quite handy if you're doing style like this. So it means I don't have to mess around with the size of the brush too much. So I'm using this technical pen to just add detail here and there and just to imply things going on. I have a reference to my side. I'm not following it really, but it's just giving me a guide of where things go. And I'm just trying to add interest to the painting and making sure I keep to where the sunlight's coming from. So the sunlight's coming from the top left. So I just got to make sure wherever I'm putting my highlights and my shadows that they're consistent quite often. And I still do it to this day, that I'll forget where the sunlight's coming from and I'll put the shadows in the wrong place. So just keep an eye on that. Mostly it doesn't really matter a massive deal when you're doing little details because you can't really tell. But if you're doing big details, then you need to be careful. So obviously there's a big shadow on the left side of those big trees. So there's one thing to be careful about with those trees on the left, and I nearly did it, and I did it a little bit, and I was like, whoa, slow down, is the snow on the left-hand trees are all in shadow. So use that blue shadow that I used everywhere for the rocks and the under part of all the snow, but don't put the highlight on. So just put the shadow. So another good reason for just using the shadow everywhere and the two-tone, which means basically the blue and the white, is that I can reuse the blue in shadow areas without really thinking about it. And but you got to be careful not to over highlight. And one of my major problems when I started painting landscape paintings about 10 years ago now, I would say, is that I used to over highlight pretty much everything. I like bright saturated paintings, and they're not realistic. I don't try to be realistic. I just like to make fun paintings, and I like them super bright and super colorful. And so, but the problem is they still need to be so there's a bunch of rules that you still can't really mess around with, or they won't work. And I kind of disregarded that and tried it anyway. I thought, nah, it'll be fine. Well, it turns out it won't be fine, and it took me 10 years to realize that. And well, maybe not 10 years, but I've probably been doing it better than the last couple. But it did take a long time. Is that if I had a nice highlight somewhere, it's like, well, that's cool, that worked, I'm putting it everywhere. But you can't do that, because if something's in shadow, it literally cannot have a highlight. It doesn't matter what style you're doing. If something's in shadow, make sure that the highlights are shadow too, if that makes sense. So to make that a bit easier, if you got white snow and the sun's hitting it, it can be white. But if it's in shadow and it's not hitting it, it kind of has to be blue. So to demonstrate that, like I said, I'm dwelling on this point because it's quite important, is the sun. So you can see on the left where the blue band goes across the floor, that's obviously the shadow of the snow. So that's what shadow snow looks like. So the trees above it, there's no way that the sun could hit that, because they themselves are blocking the sun. So that has to be the dark shadow color of the snow. You can have a little bit of white here and there where it might peek through some of the branches and stuff, but it generally has to be the shadow. So I'm just so what I do at the end of most of my paintings is I'm going to show you in a minute my layering structure, and I'll turn things on and off so you can see how I build it up. I don't use many layers. I usually have maybe like 10 or something, and I have a few less on this one. I think I only have like 8. But generally what I do for every painting is I get to a good point, and then I stick one layer on top, and I use my technical pen, small brush basically, to add bits of detail and remove bits of detail. Now I remove detail by just picking a color that's underneath the other one, which is basically erasing. Obviously I can't erase because it's a new layer, but it's effectively erasing, so a bit of negative painting going on there. So that's the layer structure here. I'm flipping them on and off so you can see. I know it's a bit quick, maybe you slow it down if you need to, but that's how I build it up. And that's how I build up every landscape painting, is from back to front. And that goes for every part of it too. So it doesn't mean that it's actually at the back. It's still a layer for each part. So even if a rock's right up the front, I still layer it, as in it has a background, middle, and a highlight. And it's that concept kind of everywhere. So I think I'm just about done with this one. If you liked it, give me a thumbs up and a sub, and I'll see you in another one. Thanks for watching.